I just watched the 1974 movie Death Wish with Charles Bronson. This was a member request from Jay, and I really enjoyed this movie. It's essentially a story about a regular guy who kind of becomes like the Punisher. And it's always really interesting to see how movies and culture have changed over the course of time when you go back to a movie like this. This movie is obviously 50 years old. And some of the conversations they have are the same shit we're talking about today, which is really funny to see. But there's definitely a different flavor to it. So the gist of the plot is that New York is a crime-ridden shithole. Jeff Goldblum and a couple other guys you can see on the screen here sexually assault Charles Bronson's daughter, who plays Mr. Kersey, and they beat up his wife while they're trying to rob their place, and she ends up dying. The daughter ends up traumatized, and he's a pacifist who slowly decides to take matters into his own hands. He's a real estate agent who goes out to Arizona for a job and to kind of get away from everything that's happened for a bit. And the Arizona guy is a gun guy and introduces him to guns and shooting, even though he was a pacifist combat vet. And he ends up killing a mugger who tries to rob him at gunpoint. He hits him with a gut shot, runs away, pukes because he just shot somebody. Really one of the few times that he shows a lot of emotion, which I thought was a smart choice. And then he starts just putting himself in position to where people will try to mug him, and then he's killing them. So he starts executing muggers all over town. And then there becomes a debate on TV because they call him the vigilante, if he's right or he should be arrested. You've seen probably similar things in a movie like Boondock Saints, but you also see other people are inspired by it. They start defending themselves. The rate of muggings, we find out, gets cut in like half. It goes from 900 a week down to just under 500. And it eventually gets to the point where the cops are like, we don't want him arrested, but we do need to scare him off to make him stop doing this so that people believe he's out there. Almost like a Batman kind of inspired fear mentality. Eventually it catches up to him. He gets hurt. And the cop says, look, if you leave the city, I'll throw your gun in the river, because he was ordered not to arrest him. And at the very end, he goes to Chicago, sees some other people assaulting a chick at the train station, and gives him the finger gun. So you know he's going to pick up his vigilantism again in Chicago. And if you know the meta, there's like 4 other movies. So I guess his wish doesn't get granted. So that's the gist of the movie. But what I really want to talk about is some of the conversations they have and just some of the things that I thought were really funny to see. So one of the big things in the movie is at the beginning, his coworkers are really pissed about the amount of crime. They're like, we should put all these people in concentration camps. Fuck them. And he's like, oh, I kind of feel bad for them. You know, they're underprivileged. And they all call him a bleeding heart liberal, which is pretty funny to hear even that long ago. It's interesting because the movie starts him out as the sympathetic one until it happens to him. And it was great seeing a guy just be a guy. Pretty stoic, taking matters into his own hands, being responsible, but still caring about his wife and daughter and his son-in-law. He wasn't some raging asshole. He wasn't throwing tantrums and crying like a bitch the whole time. He's just a man. Nothing special, nothing crazy. And it's crazy that that's refreshing in today's era where everyone's pretty much pushing for androgyny. It's also interesting if you watch movies over time to see what's viewed as a good build for a guy. Because like in the 70s, you know, movies like this, your Clint Eastwood movies, a movie like Rocky, you know, obviously movies like The Thing or Patrick Swayze back in the day, a lot of these men were just in good shape, but not crazy ripped or super defined, but they obviously took care of themselves. And then when you get into the 80s and 90s, you see more of the roided out, your Schwarzeneggers and Stallones and that type of body, where they all look just juiced to the gills. And then now you have a weird thing where guys either look like kind of bitches or they look like Chris Hemsworth, who's also probably on steroids. Like, there's not really much of a push for guys who are just in good shape in a natural looking way. It feels like it's either you're completely jacked in a way that's nowhere near obtainable for regular guys. They all look like fucking Marcus Phoenix from Gears of War, or they look like borderline women. These would be like your Timothy Chalamets. I really like the characters and the decisions they make, though. The cop is very logical. You know, obviously at this time they didn't have access to DNA and a million smartphone cameras and all that type of thing. So what he does is they find a grocery receipt at one of the killings where he killed some muggers. And he's like, okay, search within walking distance of this grocery store. And then within that distance, see how many people in the last 3 months have had a family member murdered. And then find out if any of these people are veterans from the last 3 wars. So Vietnam, Korea, and World War II. at this time. And they just slowly narrow the process down. And that's how they eventually figure out that Kersey is the guy. But I just appreciate it. It's very simple, very straightforward. This is one of those things that kind of makes me miss the older movies in some way. Like you just have a couple characters that you focus on, a pretty straightforward conflict, a straightforward character arc that you can see very clearly. And that's it. It just makes for good storytelling. You don't have to go crazy and have a million plot lines and subplots. There doesn't need to be high-paced action in every scene or explosions. You don't have to get clever with politics. You don't have to get quippy every fucking scene. Just very straightforward, hour-and-a-half movie, in, out. The only politics you even kind of get are, one, the movie seems to think that people should be able to defend themselves. Personally, I'd be okay if we were a little bit more lax with self-defense and a little bit less lawyer happy to fucking go after people for defending themselves, but doesn't matter what I think. And for the movie's politics, the police behind the scenes are like, we can't go out there and say crime's way down because then we encourage others to behave that way. Like, we can't support vigilantism, but we also don't want to put a stop to this guy because either one, he'll become a martyr, or two, crime will skyrocket now that they know he's off the streets. So it's all pretty interesting, and I think pretty realistic as far as the portrayal goes of how you deal with this type of situation. And a couple of things surprised me quite a bit, and I don't know if this is just my bias because of what the current media says about older media, but one of the things I noticed, because Hollywood would have you believe that there's never been a good black person in a movie or show before 10 years ago, is that there was a decent amount of black people in the movie, and most of them were just regular people, like cops, nurses, office admins, whatever. And most of the black people in the movie were just normal people, and a lot of the thugs were white people. Like, it's just interesting to me that if you hadn't seen it, you would think that every good person was white and every bad person was black. And something else that surprised me is, one, the rape scene was pretty brutal to watch, and it kind of felt like it went on forever, even though it was only a couple of minutes. But also, they took it very seriously. Like, she had PTSD really bad for the whole movie and ended up in a sanctorum, essentially living with a bunch of nuns and just kind of isolated because she couldn't handle being back out in the real world. Like, she couldn't even deal with talking to her husband. She was kind of almost a vegetable. And that's something else that I thought in a movie of this era might just kind of get treated as like, get over it, no big deal. It happens, whatever. I was really surprised by how it was handled in a good way. And I don't want to get too off into the weeds about politics and cultural stuff, but for instance, in California a few years ago, they passed a bunch of propositions and stuff in one of the elections to essentially stop punishing criminals, and crime, unsurprisingly, skyrocketed for things like shoplifting and misdemeanors and that sort of thing. And then the most recent election, they voted to put all that shit back in place because once they actually had to deal with the crime, they didn't fucking want to. If you're familiar with the YouTube political sphere, Anna Kasparian is part of the Young Turks. She was supportive of all this stuff until she got assaulted by a couple of homeless men in broad daylight walking her dog. And then that made her much more harsh on crime. So I just thought his arc of being essentially feeling bad and pitiful into judge, jury, and executioner was really interesting. And it's crazy that even 50 years later, we're still seeing the same behaviors and ideas and policies. And then what ends up making people change their minds is experience, which I guess is unsurprising. Another one of the conversations I thought was really funny was some guy at some elite party, obviously a lot of money there, was like, I'll tell you what though, the vigilantes are racist. He's killed more black muggers than white muggers. And a white lady responds, well, if there's more black muggers, then what do you want us to do? Do we need to make more white people start mugging people so that he can kill the same amount of muggers? Which is really funny also, because a lot of those conversations happen when you're looking at things like prison sentences and police shootings and blah, blah, blah. So I just thought it was really funny that these conversations were happening literally 50 years ago, and we're still having them fucking today. Maybe this movie was super progressive for the time. I have no idea. But I just thought that was a really funny conversation because you can hear almost identical conversations if you listen to any debate about racial equality and blah, blah, blah now. But I won't say anything else about the cultural stuff. But those two things I just thought were really interesting given the context of the movie at this time and how it still applies today. So yeah, it was way more refreshing than it should be to just see a good, straightforward movie that, if I had to guess, was probably a response to the high crime in the 60s and 70s. But you would never know that unless you had outside knowledge. You don't really need to. They say in the movie, crime's bad, and we see it happen. So yeah, it was a really good movie. Good recommendation from Jay. I heard the remake with Bruce Willis was pretty bad. It seems like it got pretty bad reception. I don't know if that's because of the movie itself or because of the message of self-defense and kind of pro-guns and that sort of thing, because it came out in like 2018. So who knows? It could just be political that it got bad reviews. But that one sounded much more revenge-driven. And this one, he never actually even finds the guys that killed his wife and assaulted his daughter. But it's not really the point. It's kind of a way for him to be able to live with himself by taking matters into his own hands and preventing more victims. So I like the message of the movie, and I enjoyed the movie. So I think it's worth checking out if you haven't seen it. Hour and a half, easy to watch. Good recommendation from Jay. And I'm enjoying kind of the range of the recommendation you guys are making so far. Gotten all kinds of shit from you guys, so it's been fun. I'm going to leave it here for this one. If you've seen the movie, let me know what you think. I try to respond to all the comments that aren't just insults. And like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.